Today on Final Sentence, we'll explore some of the most chilling cases out there. Innocent people sentenced to death, to cover for the guilty, or simply due to a tragic mistake. Subscribe to the channel now to help us keep uploading content. Give the video a like, and let's do this.
Cameron Todd Willingham, 2004. State, Texas. Charge, murder of his stepdaughters. On December 23, 1991, the quiet town of Corsicana, Texas, was about to witness a tragedy. It was an ordinary winter night. Cameron Todd Willingham, 26, was at home while his wife, Stacy Kuykendall, was away visiting her parents. That night, he was alone with her 3 daughters, Amber, 2 years old, Carmen, 1 year old, and Kylie, 3 years old. Suddenly, thick smoke filled the house. A fire spread rapidly. Willingham woke up and managed to escape, but outside he watched in horror as the flames consumed his home, with his stepdaughters still inside. None of the girls made it out alive, but the tragedy didn't end there. Just hours later, Willingham was arrested. Prosecutors claimed he had set the fire on purpose. Their reasoning? He didn't try to save them. Investigators argued that his failure to re-enter the burning house was proof of his guilt. They dismissed the possibility that the fire had spread too quickly for any rescue attempt. No physical evidence tied him to arson, yet this single accusation sealed his fate. The prosecution's case relied heavily on flawed forensic analysis. Experts at the time claimed the fire had been deliberately set, using outdated methods that have since been debunked. A witness also stated that Willingham and his wife had been arguing days before the fire, fueling the narrative that he had a motive. In a rushed trial, which lasted barely a year, Cameron was sentenced to death. For over a decade, he fought to prove his innocence, but every appeal was denied. New evidence questioning the arson claims came too late. The system refused to listen. The prosecutor leading the case, John H. Jackson. The judge who sentenced him, Gary L. Thomas. Was an innocent man executed? Let's uncover the full truth behind this controversial case. On February 17, 2004, Cameron Todd Willingham was executed in Texas, despite growing doubts about his guilt. Years later, the methods used to present the so-called evidence against him were completely discredited. Fire investigation science had advanced rapidly, and theories that once seemed irrefutable were proven wrong. The burn patterns prosecutors relied on to claim the fire was intentional were not actually indicators of arson. Those patterns, which served as the primary evidence against him, are no longer considered valid in modern forensic analysis. In other words, he was executed with no real evidence against him. No DNA testing or other forensic techniques that could have helped prove his innocence were ever used. Prosecutors ignored key evidence, including the possibility of an accidental fire, leaving Willingham condemned by flawed science that we now know was misinterpreted. The case of Cameron Todd Willingham is a chilling reminder of the dangers of a justice system that sometimes cannot correct its mistakes until it is too late. Numerous documentaries have explored this case in depth, solidifying its impact on the history of capital punishment in the United States. His last words were clear: "I did not commit this crime. I am innocent. You are killing me for something I did not do." Troy Davis, 2011. State, Georgia. Charge, murder of a police officer. August 19, 1989. It was an ordinary night in Savannah, Georgia, until a shooting took the life of a 27-year-old police officer, Mark McPhail. He was killed while trying to help a man who was being attacked in a parking lot. Troy Davis, who was 20 years old at the time, was arrested and accused of committing the crime. But what wasn't clear was whether Davis was even at the scene when the shooting occurred. When McPhail was killed, Davis was not directly in the parking lot where the incident happened. However, Sylvester Coles, the man involved in the altercation with Larry Young, later testified that Davis was the one who shot Officer McPhail. That testimony became the foundation of the prosecution's case. From the very beginning, Davis maintained his innocence. He did not commit the murder. However, the strongest evidence against him was the testimony of several witnesses who claimed to have seen him at the crime scene. But this is where the controversy began. Witnesses later changed their statements, and several admitted that they had been pressured into implicating him. Despite the doubts surrounding the testimonies and new evidence that cast serious questions on his guilt, Davis was sentenced to death in 1991. In the years following his conviction, Davis filed multiple appeals, and even the family of Officer McPhail began to question whether Troy Davis was truly responsible for their loved one's death. However, his appeals were repeatedly denied, and the Georgia justice system remained closed to the possibility of his innocence. As the years passed, the controversy only grew. The movement to free Troy Davis gained global attention, with people around the world demanding a review of his case. More than 1 million people signed a petition calling for his execution to be halted, arguing that no one should be put to death under such uncertain circumstances. The case was extensively covered by major media outlets, including CNN, The Guardian, and BBC. It was widely discussed on social media, and multiple documentaries and interviews explored his fight to avoid execution. On September 21, 2011, after years of legal battles and international protests, Troy Davis was executed by lethal injection in Georgia. Despite worldwide opposition and growing doubts about his guilt, Davis was put to death without conclusive proof against him. His last words were, "I did not kill Officer McPhail. I am innocent. The witnesses who testified against me lied." Gary Graham, State, Texas. Charge: first-degree murder. It was the night of June 7, 1981 in Houston, Texas, when Gary Graham, just 17 years old, was arrested for the murder of Robert Overstreet, a police officer. Overstreet had been shot and killed while attempting to stop a man who had stolen merchandise from a supermarket. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Graham was identified as the suspect. From the start, Graham insisted he was innocent. Despite the evidence presented against him, he never confessed to the crime. The prosecution's case hinged on a single witness who claimed to have seen Graham at the scene of the crime. That testimony would later come under serious scrutiny. Over the years, multiple key witnesses who initially identified Gary Graham as the shooter changed their statements. One of the main witnesses, Dale Tinsley, was the first to identify Graham as the gunman. However, years after the conviction, Tinsley retracted his statement, admitting that his identification of Graham had been a mistake and that he had been pressured into making the claim. Other witnesses also withdrew their testimonies, stating that they had not actually seen Graham at the scene or that their statements had been obtained under coercion or pressure. The case against Gary Graham was built on an uncertain testimony. His trial was marked by a weak defense that failed to present evidence that could have proven his innocence. As errors piled up, Gary Graham was sentenced to death in 1981. For over 18 years, Graham fought for his life, filing multiple appeals. Yet, the Texas justice system refused to take a deeper look into his case. Throughout those years, Graham maintained his innocence, while his fate seemed sealed. In 2000, just when the Texas judicial system was expected to review his case, Gary Graham was executed on June 22, 2000. Despite serious doubts about his guilt and growing calls for a more thorough review, Graham was put to death without conclusive evidence proving his involvement in the crime. The case of Gary Graham remains a tragic symbol of judicial failures, especially in the application of the death penalty based on weak and inconsistent evidence. It highlights the dangers of convicting someone solely on unreliable witness testimony, without solid physical proof. His story sparked widespread debate, leading to thousands of videos and documentaries, including The Execution of Gary Graham, which explores his case in depth. Major publications like The New York Times and PBS have also covered his wrongful conviction extensively. When asked for his last words, Gary Graham proclaimed, "I am innocent. You are killing me for a crime I did not commit." Carlos DeLuna, State, Texas. Charge: first-degree murder. On February 4, 1983, the city of Corpus Christi, Texas, was shaken by a brutal crime. Wanda Lopez, a gas station clerk, was stabbed to death while attending customers. Moments before the attack, she managed to call 911, describing a suspicious man inside the store. Her call was abruptly cut off. The sounds of the assault were the last thing recorded. Minutes later, police found Carlos DeLuna, a 20-year-old man, hiding under a truck just a few blocks away from the crime scene. He had no blood on him, no murder weapon, and no direct evidence linking him to the killing, yet he was arrested and charged with Wanda Lopez's murder. From the very beginning, DeLuna insisted he was innocent, claiming he witnessed the attack but that the real killer was Carlos Hernandez, a well-known local criminal. During the trial, the defense attempted to prove Hernandez's involvement, but prosecutors dismissed him as a phantom who didn't exist. No physical evidence connected DeLuna to the crime. His conviction rested almost entirely on the testimony of a single eyewitness, who identified him as the attacker. In 1984, Carlos DeLuna was found guilty and sentenced to death. Over the years, multiple appeals were denied. On December 7, 1989, Carlos DeLuna was executed by lethal injection at Huntsville Prison, Texas. He maintained his innocence until the very end. In 2006, an investigation by the Chicago Tribune revealed that Carlos Hernandez not only existed, but had a history of violent crimes and had confessed to multiple people that he was the real killer of Wanda Lopez. Later, in 2012, an extensive study by the Columbia Human Rights Law Review exposed critical flaws in the investigation and trial of DeLuna, suggesting that Texas had executed an innocent man. His last words were never recorded, but throughout the entire legal process, up until his execution, he maintained his innocence. Since he can no longer speak for himself, we will say it for him. I am innocent. This corrupt system is condemning me for a crime I did not commit. Glen Ford State, Louisiana. Charge: murder of Isidore Roseman. On November 5, 1983, it was a quiet night in Shreveport, Louisiana, when the life of Glen Ford, a 34-year-old man, took an irreversible turn. Isidore Roseman, a local jeweler, was murdered in his shop. The news spread quickly and the police immediately began searching for a suspect. Ford, a poor man who worked as a gardener, was arrested shortly after. But the crime wasn't as clear-cut as it seemed. No one actually knew who had committed the murder, and Ford had never been seen near the crime scene. Despite this, under circumstances that were never fully explained, Ford was linked to the crime and swiftly charged with murder. A trial built on a broken system. At trial, his defense was weak and failed to present crucial evidence that could have proven the lack of real proof against him. The prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence and unverified witness testimonies. Yet, the district attorney, James L. Ritchie, pushed forward with the charges, and Judge Henry H.R. Barham had already made up his mind. The evidence was flimsy, but the trial moved forward without review, and in 1984, Glen Ford was sentenced to death. For nearly 3 decades, Ford sat on death row, waiting for his execution. Can you imagine spending 30 years of your life locked away, surrounded by the worst criminals, never knowing which day would be your last? His fight for freedom never stopped, kept alive by human rights activists and defense attorneys who insisted that Ford should not be there. Finally, in 2014, after a thorough case review, Ford was exonerated when it was revealed that the prosecution had hidden key evidence and that there was never enough proof to convict him in the first place. It was determined that Ford had absolutely nothing to do with the crime. James Ritchie, the prosecutor who had built the case, and Judge Henry Barham, who had sentenced him to death, could do nothing to undo the irreversible mistake. But the story didn't end there. Although Ford was eventually released, he had already spent almost 30 years on death row. His health deteriorated rapidly. In 2015, he was diagnosed with cancer and passed away that same year at the age of 65. Glen Ford's case is a painful reminder of the flaws in the justice system and human decision-making. A man spent nearly his entire life behind bars in the worst possible situation, believing that at any moment he would be taken away to be executed, all for a crime he didn't commit. It's a clear example of how a low-income individual was forced to defend himself against a massive accusation, murdering a well-known lawyer. The real perpetrators, of course, were never found. Before his death, he gave a few interviews. "I was on death row, confined to a single cell, 23 hours a day in my cell, 1 hour outside for a shower and other things like exercise, things like that. I tried to keep myself busy, drawing, writing, reading, listening to music. That's what I did all the time." Ruben Cantu. State, Texas. Charge: capital murder. November 8, 1984. It was a quiet night in San Antonio, Texas, until gunshots shattered the silence. In a partially built house, Pedro Gomez and Juan Moreno, two construction workers who slept there to prevent theft, were attacked by two armed men. Gomez died instantly, while Moreno was shot multiple times but survived. Police found no eyewitnesses and no conclusive forensic evidence. In the first days of the investigation, Moreno was unable to identify his attackers. There were no fingerprints, no murder weapon, and no direct link to any suspect. Weeks passed with no progress until the police received a tip. Ruben Cantu, a 17-year-old with no criminal record, was named as a suspect. The lead came from a police officer who knew Cantu and considered him a troublemaker in the making. With no physical evidence, no additional witnesses, and only the word of a wounded man under pressure, Cantu was arrested. Moreno was pushed to identify the suspect. After multiple interrogations, he finally pointed to Cantu as the shooter. That testimony became the key piece of evidence in the case. The trial was quick, with a defense that was virtually non-existent. Cantu's court-appointed lawyers did not challenge the lack of physical evidence, did not question the reliability of the key witness, and failed to bring up Cantu's solid alibi. The prosecution built its entire case on Moreno's testimony, the lone survivor of the attack. There were no fingerprints, no weapon, no witnesses placing Cantu at the crime scene. Despite this, prosecutor Sam Millsap insisted he was guilty. Judge Roy Barrera Jr. presided over the trial. On August 8, 1985, Ruben Cantu was found guilty of capital murder. He was 18 years old when he heard his sentence, death. For years, Cantu insisted on his innocence. He filed multiple appeals, but all were denied. In 1993, his execution was scheduled, and on August 24th, he was taken to the lethal injection chamber at Huntsville Prison in Texas. Shortly after his execution, the case fell apart. Juan Moreno recanted his testimony, admitting that police had pressured him into identifying Cantu. He also revealed that he had never actually believed Cantu was the killer. Additionally, the alleged accomplice, David Garza, stated that Cantu had no involvement in the crime. The police never investigated alternative leads and, with Cantu's execution, closed the case without ever seeking the real perpetrator. In 2005, Sam Millsap, the prosecutor who built the case against him, publicly admitted that the trial had been a mistake. What was once considered a solid case became a judicial disgrace years later. Ruben Cantu was executed without a single piece of evidence against him. His case remains one of the most shocking wrongful convictions in Texas history, a stark reminder that the death penalty is an irreversible tool, one that should never be in human hands, because if a mistake is discovered, there is no way to correct it. His last words were, "I didn't do anything. I am innocent." Claude Jones, State, Texas. Charge: murder during a robbery. November 14, 1989. It was an ordinary night in Point Blank, Texas, a small town with fewer than 500 residents. The town's quiet was shattered when a man entered a roadside liquor store. Alan Hilsendogger, the store owner, was alone when the doorbell rang. Minutes later, he was shot at point-blank range. The killer left without taking anything of value. Hilsendogger died instantly. There were no eyewitnesses to the crime, only fear and confusion left behind in the community. The police arrived quickly and launched an investigation. With no clear evidence and pressure to find a suspect, authorities focused on Claude Jones, a man with a prior record for robbery. The accusation against him relied on the testimony of an alleged accomplice, Timothy Jordan, who claimed Jones had confessed to the murder. But the most damning piece of evidence was a single strand of hair found at the crime scene. According to prosecutors, it belonged to Jones. Police never found the murder weapon in his possession, no fingerprints in the store linked him to the crime, and no witnesses placed him at the scene. Yet, he was arrested. Jones's trial was filled with irregularities. The key evidence against him was a hair analysis, an unreliable forensic technique at the time, incapable of definitively identifying a person. Despite this, an expert testified that the hair found at the crime scene was consistent with Jones. The defense argued that there was no solid physical evidence, but prosecutor William Lee Hahn relied on the testimony of the alleged accomplice, Timothy Jordan, to strengthen the case. Jordan, in exchange for testifying against Jones, avoided the death penalty himself. Judge Michael Mays presided over the trial. On April 2, 1990, Claude Jones was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death. For a decade, Jones fought to prove his innocence. His defense requested DNA testing on the hair used as evidence against him, but the request was denied. The state of Texas refused to reconsider his case. On December 7, 2000, at the age of 60, Jones was taken to the execution chamber at Huntsville Prison, Texas, where he was given a lethal injection. He was the last prisoner executed during George W. Bush's governorship. Years later, in 2010, the DNA test Jones had requested during his lifetime was finally conducted. The hair found at the crime scene did not belong to him. The only physical evidence used to convict him was debunked. Had the DNA test been allowed before his execution, Jones would have had a chance to prove his innocence. His case is a tragic example of how a lack of forensic scrutiny and a refusal to review evidence can cost an innocent person their life. His last words were, "If I have to die, let it be with dignity, but I am not the man you're looking for." Brandon Bernard, State, Indiana. Charge, first-degree murder. June 21, 1999. It was a sunny day in Killeen, Texas. Todd and Stacy Bagley, a young Christian pastor couple, were driving down the highway when they stopped to pick up a group of teenagers hitchhiking. Without hesitation, they decided to help them. What they didn't know was that within hours, that decision would lead them to a tragic fate. The couple disappeared. No one saw them alive again. Hours later, police found their burned-out car in a remote area inside the Fort Hood military base. Inside, they discovered the charred remains of Todd and Stacy Bagley. The community was in shock. Who could commit such a brutal crime? Investigators quickly determined that the Bagleys had not died in the fire. Both had been held against their will before their vehicle was set ablaze. Todd had been shot in the head. Stacy, however, was still alive when the flames consumed her. The evidence led to the arrest of 5 young men, all under the age of 20. Among them was 18-year-old Brandon Bernard. Prosecutors argued that Bernard played a key role in the crime's execution. The trial was swift and decisive. Christopher Villalba, another suspect, was identified as the group's leader and the one who fired the fatal shots that killed Todd and Stacy. However, Bernard's role in the crime became a source of major controversy. Prosecutors claimed that while Bernard did not pull the trigger, he was the one who doused the car with gasoline and set it on fire, sealing Stacy's fate as she was still showing signs of life when the flames engulfed her. The defense argued that Bernard had not planned the crime, that he was merely following orders, and that he had been manipulated by Villalba. But the jury showed no mercy. On June 13, 2000, Judge James R. Nowlin sentenced Brandon Bernard to death. Condemned and locked away on death row, Bernard spent more than 20 years awaiting execution. Over time, doubts about his case began to surface. Public figures and anti-death penalty organizations started advocating for him. Kim Kardashian, among other high-profile individuals, called for clemency, arguing that Bernard had changed and deserved a second chance. But his appeals were denied one after another. On December 10, 2020, at the age of 40, Bernard was taken to the execution chamber at the Terre Haute Federal Penitentiary in Indiana. 5 of the 9 jurors who had sentenced him to death later stated that if they had known more details about his role in the crime, they would not have sentenced him to die. His execution sparked outrage and reignited the debate over capital punishment, especially in cases where the convicted individual was not the main perpetrator and had shown evidence of rehabilitation. Bernard was executed, but his case left behind an open question. Is the death penalty a tool of justice or an irreversible act of vengeance? Before receiving the lethal injection, he addressed the victims' families with his final words, "I'm so sorry for the pain I caused you. I wish I could take it back, but I can't." Larry Griffin, State, Missouri. Charge, first-degree murder. June 26, 1980. On a hot afternoon in St. Louis, Missouri, 19-year-old Quentin Moss was standing at the intersection of Sarah and Olive Streets, an area known for drug-related activity. As Moss talked with acquaintances, a vehicle approached slowly. Without warning, a burst of gunfire erupted from the car. Moss collapsed, struck by multiple bullets. A passerby, Wallace Connors, was also wounded in the shooting. The vehicle sped away. leaving the community in shock and searching for answers. Yet the police investigation quickly focused on 25-year-old Larry Griffin. His brother, Dennis Griffin, had been murdered months earlier, with Moss as the prime suspect, though he was never formally charged. Authorities built their case primarily on the testimony of Robert Fitzgerald, a supposed eyewitness who claimed to have seen Griffin firing from the car. No physical evidence directly linked Griffin to the crime. There were no fingerprints, no weapon, and no conclusive proof tying him to the shooting. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, Griffin was arrested and charged with Moss's murder. During the trial, the prosecution relied heavily on Fitzgerald's testimony. The defense challenged his credibility, pointing out inconsistencies in his story and his criminal history. However, the jury found his testimony convincing enough to convict Griffin. On December 20th, 1983, Judge Jack L. Coeur sentenced Larry Griffin to death. For years, Griffin maintained his innocence and exhausted all possible appeals, without success. On June 21, 1995, at the age of 40, he was executed by lethal injection at the Potosi Correctional Center in Missouri. Before his execution, Griffin expressed regret that he had never been given the opportunity to prove his innocence. A decade later, in 2005, the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund launched an investigation that raised serious doubts about Griffin's guilt. It was revealed that Robert Fitzgerald, the key witness, may not have even been present at the crime scene. Additionally, Wallace Connors, the surviving shooting victim, stated that Griffin was not involved in the attack. Following these findings, prosecutor Jennifer Joyce reopened the case. However, after reviewing the evidence, she concluded that Griffin's conviction had been justified, though doubts about his guilt still persist to this day. Larry Griffin's case highlights the potential failures of the justice system and raises serious questions about the application of the death penalty, especially in cases where the evidence is limited or questionable. George Stinney Jr., State, South Carolina. Charge: first-degree murder, March 23, 1944. In the small community of Alcolu, South Carolina, two young girls, 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 7-year-old Mary Emma Thames, disappeared while out picking flowers. The next day, their bodies were found in a ditch, showing signs of severe blunt force trauma. The community, shocked and outraged, demanded swift justice. The police quickly focused on George Stinney Jr., a 14-year-old African-American boy who had reportedly been seen speaking with the girls the previous day. Without his parents or a lawyer present, George was interrogated for hours. Authorities claimed he confessed to the crime, though no written or signed confession was ever presented. No physical evidence linked him to the murders. The trial took place on April 24, 1944. George's defense was almost non-existent. His lawyer, a tax collector with no experience in criminal cases, called no witnesses and presented no evidence in his favor. The trial lasted just 2.5 hours, and the all-white jury deliberated for only 10 minutes before finding him guilty. Judge Philip H. Stoll sentenced George to death by electrocution. Despite efforts from organizations and individuals pleading for clemency due to his young age, the execution proceeded on June 16, 1944. At just 14 years old, George Stinney Jr. became the youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century. Due to his small size and weight, execution officials struggled to fit him into the electric chair, which was designed for adults. Decades later, in 2014, the case was re-examined. Judge Carmen Mullen overturned the conviction, ruling that George had not received a fair trial and that his confession was likely coerced. Though symbolic, this ruling acknowledged the grave injustice committed 70 years earlier. The case of George Stinney Jr. highlights the deep flaws of the justice system at the time, shaped by racial prejudice and a lack of legal protections, and serves as a stark reminder of the importance of fairness and due process in legal proceedings. Joe Arady, State, Colorado. Charge: rape and first-degree murder. August 15, 1936. In the city of Pueblo, Colorado, sisters Dorothy and Barbara Drain were attacked while sleeping in their home. Dorothy, 15, was raped and murdered with a blunt weapon, while Barbara, 12, survived the assault. The community was horrified and demanded immediate justice. A few days later, police arrested Joe Arity, a 21-year-old man with severe intellectual disabilities, who had been found wandering aimlessly in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Arity, who had an IQ of 46, was extensively interrogated without a lawyer present. Due to his limited understanding and eagerness to please authority figures, he eventually confessed to the crime. However, his confession contained numerous inconsistencies and incorrect details about the attack. Arity's trial was swift. Despite the lack of physical evidence linking him to the crime and serious doubts about his ability to comprehend legal proceedings, he was found guilty. The judge sentenced him to death in the gas chamber. During his time on death row, the prison warden described Arity as the happiest man on death row, largely due to his childlike innocence and lack of awareness of his dire situation. Before his execution, when informed of his fate, he responded with confusion, "No, no. Joe won't die." His words struck those who heard his story, perhaps hinting at an understanding that his personality, his essence, wouldn't die, or simply reflecting his inability to grasp the reality of his imminent death. For his last meal, he requested ice cream. After eating part of it, he asked for the rest to be saved for later, not realizing he would not have another chance to eat it. On January 6, 1939, Joe Arity was executed. In his final moments, he remained calm, smiling as he was led to the gas chamber. The prison warden, Roy Best, who had developed a bond with Arity, stood by him and wept during the execution. Best had tried, unsuccessfully, to obtain clemency for him. Decades later, in 2011, Colorado Governor Bill Ritter granted Arity a posthumous pardon, acknowledging the severe injustices in his case and the overwhelming likelihood that he was innocent.
That's it for today's video. There are many more cases like these. If you made it this far, it would mean a lot if you subscribed, gave the video a like, and left a comment. Even just a simple hi. You're probably watching this on a TV, and if that's the case, I just want to thank you for staying with me until the end. You can visit the channel and find more high-quality content. This is Final Sentence.